This is my true story. I gave my son everything, my hands, my youth, my life, so he could live with comfort and pride. But one night, I asked for a little extra food, and he locked me in the basement like a stranger. Hunger turned to clarity that night. I realized I had spent my whole life feeding someone who would never feed me back. When morning came, I didn't cry. I acted. What I did next changed everything. But before I tell you, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is, and don't forget to subscribe. I spent my life working for him. Every drop of sweat that left my skin had a name, his. I started working before sunrise and came home long after the moon was high. The farm wasn't big, but it was honest. My hands had cracks that never healed. My back carried pain that no doctor could cure, but every ache felt worth it because I was building something, not for me, but for him. My dream wasn't money, it was legacy. I wanted him to live easy, to never know what hunger or fear felt like. I still remember the first pair of shoes I bought for him. They were a size too big, and he stumbled around the house proudly, like a man walking on clouds. That day, I promised myself he would never have to walk barefoot again, not in this world, not while I had strength left. So, I worked harder. When the rains came late and the fields gave nothing, I went hungry and pretended I wasn't. When money ran low, I sold my watch and told him I didn't need it. My only goal was his comfort. Every evening I would sit outside, eating plain rice and lentils, and I'd hear him laughing from his room, the sound of a television playing, plates clinking with a full meal. It made me smile. That laugh was my reward. I didn't need thanks, I just needed him to be happy. Over the years, as I aged, my bones began to slow down. The world outside my door grew faster, louder, and less kind. But I didn't mind it. I thought that once a man gives his life to raising a good son, he earns his peace. I thought my peace would come from the same house I built, surrounded by the love I had given. But I was wrong. It started small. He began to look at me differently, not with love, but with irritation. My presence in the kitchen felt like a burden. My requests became interruptions. I told myself it was stress, maybe work, but as months passed, I noticed how his tone sharpened, how his patience thinned. Meals became smaller. Sometimes there wasn't enough rice on my plate. I thought it was a mistake. Maybe he forgot. I didn't complain. I didn't want him to feel guilty. I had taught him better than that, or so I believed. There was a time he used to call me father with pride. Now he said it like a chore. The warmth in his voice was gone. I could feel the distance growing, invisible but heavy. Still, I told myself, love doesn't vanish overnight. It only gets tired sometimes. I helped around the house, even when my hands trembled. I swept floors, folded clothes, tended the small garden. The little patch of soil behind the house was my last joy. I grew vegetables there, tomatoes, beans, and a few flowers. The smell of earth still reminded me of who I was, a man who made things grow. Sometimes I'd see him watching from the window. There was no pride in his eyes, only impatience, as if he was counting the days until I became invisible. I remember one winter evening when the cold wind seeped through the windows. I made soup for both of us, using the last of the vegetables from my garden. I served him first, as always. He didn't even look up. He just ate, scrolling on his phone, while I sat quietly, sipping what little was left. The warmth of that soup was the only kindness in the room. People think betrayal is loud, shouting, breaking things, doors slamming. But that's not true. Real betrayal is quiet. It's when someone stops seeing you. It's when they stop hearing your voice, even when you're sitting right in front of them. I never wanted wealth. I only wanted warmth. I wanted a seat at the table I built, not as a burden, but as a father. I wanted to be asked, "Are you okay?" At least once. But as days passed, silence grew between us like a wall of stone. My neighbors often said, "You're lucky, old man. You have a son. He'll take care of you." I used to smile, pretending they were right. I didn't want them to know the truth, that sometimes loneliness lives even in a full house. Every night I prayed the same prayer. God, give me one more morning where my son looks at me with love. Some prayers go unanswered not because God is cruel, but because people are. As my health declined, my hunger grew weaker. My portions shrank without complaint. My body accepted less, but my heart craved what no plate could hold: respect. One afternoon, I found an old photo in the drawer. It was of me and him when he was a child. He was sitting on my shoulders, laughing, pointing at something in the distance. His little hands were gripping my head tightly. That photo felt like another life, a story that ended without warning. I traced my finger over his face in the picture, remembering how I used to dream of that little boy growing into a good man. I had given everything, my youth, my health, my time, so he could have choices I never had. But I had forgotten to teach him one thing: gratitude. Years of hard work can build a house, but only gratitude can make it a home. When I retired, I thought I would finally rest. But retirement in that house felt like punishment. Every sound reminded me of how unwanted I had become. Every meal was smaller, every look colder, every word sharper. Still, I stayed quiet. People like me don't complain, we just endure. That's what I told myself, until the night he locked me in the basement. That night would change everything. Cruelty never begins with a slap. It starts with sighs, rolled eyes, and silence where warmth used to live. My son didn't become cruel overnight. He just stopped being kind. It began in small moments, almost invisible at first. He stopped greeting me when he came home. He stopped asking if I had eaten. He stopped noticing when I coughed or limped across the floor. I became part of the furniture, there, but unseen. He began to talk to me as if I were a stranger borrowing space in his house. If I asked a question, he gave one-word answers. If I spoke about the farm or my younger days, he'd look at his phone, waiting for me to finish so he could leave the room. My stories, once lessons, had become noise. At first, I thought maybe he was just tired. Everyone changes with age. Maybe he had pressure from work. Maybe the city had hardened him. But even tired hearts don't forget how to care. And his had forgotten. Meals became shorter, colder. There were nights when I would come to the table and find only scraps left: bones, rice grains, the remains of a meal that once would have been shared. I used to sit there quietly, pretending I wasn't hungry, sipping water and smiling faintly, as if I had already eaten earlier. That lie became my dinner. He began keeping the refrigerator locked, said it was to save money because food was going missing. I never argued. I had no strength left to fight over bread or soup. I simply began to ration what I was given. But hunger isn't just a body's cry. It's a mirror of the soul. It shows you what you've become to the people you love. Every night, my body ached, not from starvation, but from disappointment. Sometimes I'd wake early, long before sunrise, and go sit by the window. The house would be quiet, and I'd listen to the hum of the refrigerator behind the locked door. The sound was almost mocking. Food was there, close enough to smell but not to taste. It reminded me of my childhood, of the poverty I'd spent my entire life fighting to escape. Only this time, hunger didn't come from poverty. It came from betrayal. I began to notice how my son spoke to his wife when he thought I couldn't hear. He'd complain about me, saying I was too slow, too demanding, too old to be useful. She would nod, half listening, pretending to care but doing nothing. They'd laugh sometimes. I'd hear my name followed by whispers. Those whispers were sharper than knives. Old age strips you slowly. First your strength, then your pride, then your voice. I had lost all three in that house. There were times I thought of leaving, but where would I go? The world outside isn't kind to men like me. Men with wrinkles deeper than their savings. Men who gave everything to family and kept nothing for themselves. The thought of dying alone frightened me more than the cruelty I lived with. So, I stayed. But staying came with its own price. Every day, the space I occupied in his house shrank. My chair moved closer to the corner. My plate grew smaller. My presence became lighter, easier to ignore. Once, I accidentally dropped a glass. It shattered on the floor, and I bent down quickly to clean it before he saw. But he heard the sound. He rushed in, anger bursting out like a storm. "Can't you even hold a glass now?" he barked. I looked down, afraid to speak. He snatched the broom from my hand and cleaned it himself, muttering about how useless I had become. I wanted to say sorry. I wanted to explain. But no apology could fix what he had already stopped seeing: my humanity. I remember another evening. The power went out, and I lit a candle. I sat by it, remembering my wife. I whispered her name softly, talking to her as if she were still there, telling her how hard it had become to stay strong. I didn't notice when he entered. He saw me and laughed under his breath. Talking to ghosts again? Then he turned off the candlelight with his fingers, leaving me in darkness. That night, I cried quietly, not because of what he said, but because I realized he wasn't my boy anymore. He was a stranger with my eyes. It's strange how time can twist love. The same hands that once held his face now trembled when he walked past. The same mouth that used to sing lullabies now stayed shut to avoid anger. Still, part of me hoped that one morning he would wake up and remember. Maybe he'd bring tea, maybe he'd say, "Father, come sit." I lived on that hope for months. Hope became my only meal. Then came the day I saw what real cruelty looked like, not from the world, but from my own blood. That night, the food was short again. I hadn't eaten all day. The hunger gnawed at me like a wild dog. My hands shook as I approached the kitchen. I asked him gently if there was a little more rice left. Not a meal, just a handful. He didn't even look up. His face tightened, his jaw clenched, and something dark passed over his eyes. He stood up slowly and slammed the chair backward. The noise startled me. His wife froze. The silence that followed was colder than any winter. Then he turned toward me. His anger wasn't just anger, it was disgust, like I had done something unholy. He started shouting that old men like me ate too much, that I had done nothing but exist. I stood there, too shocked to speak. The words cut deeper than any wound I'd ever known. I tried to explain, but he didn't hear a word. His rage filled the room like smoke. Before I knew it, he pushed me toward the basement door. The fall wasn't far, but the pain wasn't in my body. It was in the heart. The door slammed shut, and I heard the click of the lock. I called his name once, twice. No answer. The air down there was thick, musty, cold. There was no light, just a small vent where the moon spilled a thin silver line. I sat there for hours, my knees drawn close, my stomach growling. Every sound above, footsteps, laughter, the clatter of dishes, reminded me of what I had become in that house. Nothing. That night, I realized something I should have known long ago. Love doesn't fade, it's buried. Buried under greed, under pride, under years of unspoken disappointment. I had raised a boy who had everything but gratitude, and I had created him. Down in that darkness, I promised myself one thing: I would never beg again, not for food, not for kindness, not for space in my own life. The cruelty that began with silence had now found its voice, but so had I. That night, something inside me changed forever. The night began like any other, quiet and heavy with the sound of distant wind brushing against the windows. The house was dimly lit, the table half set. I had spent the evening sitting in my old chair, listening to the sounds of laughter coming from upstairs. The smell of food filled the air, rice, curry, something warm, but no one called me to the table. It was not unusual anymore. I had grown used to eating late, to scraping what was left, to pretending I was not hungry. Still, hunger makes a man foolish, and that night I made the mistake of asking. When I heard them in the kitchen, I walked in slowly, my knees aching from the cold floor. My voice came out soft, careful, almost apologetic. I asked for just a little more food, a small portion, a spoonful even. Nothing grand, just enough to quiet the growl in my stomach. I had worked all my life to feed others. I didn't think asking for a warm meal at my age was too much. But the air changed. He turned toward me with an expression I can't forget, the kind of disgust that strips a man of his worth before a word is spoken. His face twisted, his jaw tightened, and I saw anger rise where love used to live. The plate in his hand clattered against the table. His wife froze, her eyes darting between us like a trapped bird. Then, without warning, his voice split the room. He shouted that I was ungrateful, that I was always taking, that old people like me did nothing but eat and sleep. I stood there, stunned, trying to understand how a simple request for food had become a crime. Before I could speak, before I could remind him that every meal he had ever eaten came from my hands, he raised his arm. The first shove was small, almost clumsy, the kind of push that comes more from frustration than strength. But it was enough. I stumbled back, my foot catching the edge of the step near the basement door. The next moment came too fast to think. His hand hit the door, it swung open, and my body fell backward into the darkness below. The door slammed shut above me, and the sound of the lock sliding into place echoed through the cold air. At first, I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the faint beam of light leaking through the gap under the door. My chest hurt, not from the fall, but from the silence that followed. There was no apology, no sound of footsteps coming back, just muffled laughter upstairs, the clink of plates, and a faint song playing from the television. They were still eating. That sound broke something inside me. I had spent my entire life fighting hunger, not for myself, but for him. Every meal I had ever missed, every piece of bread I had given away, every sleepless night I had spent worrying about how to fill his plate. All of it came rushing back like ghosts of sacrifices long buried. And now, I was the one left hungry. The basement smelled of old paint, damp wood, and forgotten things. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. My stomach growled, but my heart was louder. I sat up slowly, leaning against the wall, and tried to steady my breath. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of realization. I wasn't his father anymore. I was his burden. Hours passed, like years. I could hear the faint creak of the ceiling above me, the sound of footsteps moving around. Sometimes laughter, sometimes silence. Once, I thought I heard my name, but it wasn't said with concern, only with annoyance. Even in that small darkness, I couldn't hate him. Not yet. Love doesn't die in a moment. It fades slowly, like the last flame of a candle fighting against the dark. I thought about his childhood, the nights when storms shook the house and he'd crawl into my bed, trembling. The mornings I'd wake before sunrise to prepare his lunch for school. The day I sold my watch, the one my father gave me, to buy him his first bicycle. I had believed those moments meant something, but life has a way of showing you that love, when unreturned, can turn into a slow poison. My back ached from the cold floor, and I tried to sleep, but the mind doesn't rest when it's broken. I kept seeing his face, not the face of the man who had just locked me away, but the face of the boy I once carried on my shoulders. I wondered how the two could be the same, how the hands that once hugged me could be the same hands that pushed me into the dark. At one point, I heard his wife's voice through the floorboards. She said something about me being too old to live alone. He laughed. The sound was bitter, mocking, careless. They clinked their glasses together, and I realized they were celebrating. I leaned back against the wall and smiled, not from joy, but from understanding. Some lessons come only when the world has taken everything from you. My hunger faded after a while, replaced by something sharper. Resolve. I stopped feeling sorry for myself. Pity doesn't feed the soul. It weakens it. That night, in that basement, I decided I would never let anyone make me feel small again. There was an old window near the ceiling, covered with dust. I stood up slowly, using the wall to steady myself, and looked through it. The moonlight spilled into the room, silver and cold. Outside, I could see the faint outline of the garden. The same soil I had once tilled with my hands, now untended and wild. Even the earth had been forgotten. That sight hurt more than hunger. I whispered a small prayer. Not for revenge, but for clarity. I didn't want to strike back with anger. I wanted balance. I wanted him to feel what I felt, the quiet emptiness, the weight of being invisible in a place that once called you home. Time moved slowly. The clock above the basement, the one I used to fix every year, struck midnight. Then one, then two. The house grew quiet, heavy with sleep. That's when I made my decision. By morning, the house would no longer hold me. I would leave, but not as a broken man sneaking out in shame. I would leave with purpose. I had given him everything: money, time, blood, sweat. And now I would take back what I had the right to. I thought of the car parked outside, the one I had helped him buy. I had paid half the cost from my savings, back when I still believed he was building a better life. The papers, the insurance, the ownership, all still had my name on them. He had taken my pride. I would take back what was mine. When the first rays of dawn crept into the small window, I heard footsteps again. Lighter this time. The door unlocked, and there she was, his wife. She didn't speak. She just opened the door, placed a small bowl of rice on the step, and walked away. I didn't touch it. My hunger wasn't in my stomach anymore. It was in my heart, and rice couldn't fill it. I waited until the house fell silent again, then climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. The living room was empty. The television still flickered, half muted. The smell of stale food hung in the air. I stood there for a moment, staring at the table where it all began, and I made a promise to myself: I would never sit there again. That night had broken something sacred, but it had also built something new: courage. The kind that comes from pain, the kind that doesn't roar but whispers, "Enough." When I stepped outside, the air was cold, but free. I looked at the sky, the same sky that had watched me raise him, feed him, forgive him. And I realized that forgiveness had its limits. Love without respect is just self-destruction. The night of humiliation ended when I stopped being afraid. I was no longer a victim in my story. I was the author again. That night didn't just show me his cruelty. It reminded me of my worth. And by the next sunrise, I knew exactly what I had to do. That night stretched longer than any night of my life. The kind of night that refuses to end, where the silence weighs more than the darkness. The world above my head slept, but inside that small, cold room beneath the floorboards, something inside me stayed wide awake. I could hear faint sounds through the wood, the soft ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional cough of the house settling. But what echoed most was the memory of his voice shouting, the lock clicking, and the sound of my heart breaking in quiet pieces. I sat on the basement floor, my knees pulled to my chest, my body trembling from the chill. There was a small draft coming from the tiny window above, the kind that carried the scent of night and loneliness. My back ached from the hard concrete, but I didn't move much. I was afraid that if I stood, I would fall apart completely. Hunger clawed at my stomach again, but I ignored it. The pain of betrayal had already numbed every other feeling. Hunger was familiar. I had met it before in the early years when I worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. But betrayal, that was new. It wasn't the kind that comes from strangers. It was born inside my own home, wearing my son's face. That kind of pain doesn't stab. It seeps. It spreads slowly, finding every corner of your memory and poisoning it. I thought of the years I had carried him on my shoulders when his legs were too short to walk. I remembered how he used to fall asleep on my lap, his head resting against my chest, his tiny fingers gripping my shirt like I was his whole world. Those same fingers had now locked the door that kept me trapped in the dark. How does love turn into this? I kept asking myself that question, but there was no answer. The clock upstairs struck 2. Each chime hit me like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. I tried to think of something good, something warm, but every memory led back to the same house, the same sun, the same disappointment. I closed my eyes and pictured the farm where I grew up. Wide fields, golden under the sun. The smell of earth, the sound of birds, the sight of honest work that gave meaning to each day. I remembered the way my father taught me to survive hunger. When the stomach growls, remember what you're fighting for. That memory lit a small spark inside me. I wasn't just hungry for food anymore. I was hungry for dignity, for the respect that had been taken from me piece by piece. The basement was quiet, except for the distant murmur of the world above. I could hear them moving about. Laughter once, maybe from the television. Then footsteps. Slow, heavy ones. Maybe he was checking if I was still down there. Maybe he felt proud. The thought made my stomach twist, but I didn't let anger take me. Anger makes noise. I had learned long ago that silence is stronger. I stared at the shadow of the window on the wall, a faint silver line drawn by the moon. It looked like a door that refused to open. I whispered into the stillness, not to anyone, not even to God, just to myself. Never again. It was then that my thoughts began to turn, slow and deliberate, like a man remembering an old map. Somewhere deep inside me, reason began to return. My mind, once heavy with hurt, started to work again, quietly, carefully, like it used to when I handled business, property papers, and finances. I had not forgotten those things. Age had not taken that from me. In that cold darkness, I began to count the things that were still mine. I still had my savings account, modest, but untouched. I still had access to some old investments under my name. I still had certain documents, deeds, and certificates that the boy had never bothered to ask about. I still had my legal rights. Most importantly, I still had my will. Not the one written on paper, but the will that beats inside a man's chest when life tries to erase him. The clock struck 3. The house was now completely silent. Even the refrigerator hum seemed to die down. The world above was sleeping, but my mind was alive, planning, counting, remembering. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking like a father. I was thinking like a man who had been wronged, a man who had something to reclaim. I thought of his car, the one parked in the garage like a trophy. It had been a gift once, years ago, when I sold a small piece of my land to help him buy it. The registration, the original documents, they still had my name on them. I remembered the signatures clearly because they were written with my hand. That car was mine by law, even if he drove it like it was his kingdom. A strange calmness filled me as I realized it. Not joy, not revenge, just a quiet understanding that the law, unlike people, doesn't forget. I began to imagine what I would do next, not out of spite, but out of necessity. The world had shown me its cruelty. I would answer with clarity. I would not shout. I would not strike him. I would not even tell him what I was about to do. I would act with the same silence he had given me, steady, unshakable, and absolute. I looked around the basement again. The walls were cracked, but I could see them clearly now. My eyes had adjusted to the dark. It reminded me of something, how life, no matter how dark it gets, eventually becomes visible if you stop fighting the night. There was an old shelf in the corner, filled with things long forgotten, rusted tools, an empty paint can, a box of nails. I used the handle of a broom to reach the small window. It wouldn't open fully, but it gave me a breath of cold, fresh air. That air felt like freedom. I breathed deeply and smiled for the first time in hours. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a survivor's smile. Somewhere above, a door creaked. Maybe his wife was checking on me again. Maybe she pitied me. Maybe she didn't. It didn't matter anymore. Pity couldn't feed me. Pity couldn't undo what had been done. As dawn approached, I began to feel stronger, not in body, but in spirit. The long night had stripped me down to the core, and what remained was something harder than before. Pain is a strange teacher. It doesn't give lectures. It carves lessons into your bones. By the time I saw the faint light of morning creeping through the window, I had already made my decision. I would leave that house, not as a broken father, but as a man reclaiming what was his. I would sell that car, the symbol of his arrogance, and use it to fund my escape. I would leave quietly, without a word, without a trace. I would go far enough that his cruelty could never reach me again. The more I thought of it, the calmer I became. Revenge was not my goal. Peace was. The kind of peace that comes from taking back control. I waited in silence as the first rays of morning turned the cold gray walls into shades of gold. The house above began to stir. Footsteps, the sound of running water, a kettle whistling. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, "This ends today." When the basement door finally opened, I didn't rush out. I stood, stretched my aching legs, and climbed the stairs slowly. My back was straight. My eyes were clear. I had been humiliated, yes, but I had also been reborn. Every man has a breaking point, but the wise ones learn to build something from the pieces. That night, in the quiet dark, I built my plan. And when I finally stepped into the sunlight, I knew. He had locked me in hunger, but he had also unlocked something far greater inside me. Freedom. Morning came quietly, without sound or warmth. The first light touched the cracks in the old basement window, spilling pale gold across the dust. I stood for a long time before I moved, letting my eyes adjust to the brightness that felt too gentle for the ugliness of the night before. My body ached from the cold floor, but the ache felt small compared to the fire in my chest. I climbed the stairs one step at a time, each step slow and steady, like a man rising from the grave. When I reached the door, I stopped. The handle felt cold under my palm. I half expected it to be locked again, but when I turned it, the latch gave way, and the door opened without resistance. The smell of stale food greeted me, mixed with the faint scent of perfume and sleep. The world above was awake, but still unaware that I was done being small. The kitchen was empty. Plates sat in the sink, unwashed. Crumbs scattered across the table like little reminders of disrespect. I looked at them without emotion. I had lived too long to waste anger on crumbs. My eyes found the wall clock, 6:15 a.m. He would still be asleep. The boy who once woke up early for school now couldn't wake up for life. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it slowly. My throat was dry from the hours in darkness, but the water tasted like something else: freedom. I walked to my room, the one they had slowly emptied over the months, making space for their new furniture and decorations. The shelves that once held my books were bare. My photographs were gone, replaced by ornaments that had no soul. I opened my drawer, the one thing they never touched. Inside were the pieces of my past that still belonged to me: my passport, old documents, and a small metal box. I lifted it, feeling the familiar weight of the years I had lived and saved. Inside the box was my insurance file, a few bonds, a copy of property deeds, and a single key, the one to the car that sat in the driveway. I smiled faintly. That car, polished and flaunted by my son, was still mine by law. He had forgotten that I had helped him buy it, that I had signed the papers, that I had kept the original title under my own name. The arrogance of youth often forgets the patience of the old. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened each document carefully, the way I used to handle farm papers back in the day. My eyesight wasn't perfect anymore, but I could still read every line that mattered. The property he called his house, not mine, was bought under joint authority. My name was on the purchase certificate. His car was registered to me as primary owner. His bank account was linked to mine through joint access from years ago. He thought he had shut me out, but he had only walked away from the hand that fed him. I folded the papers neatly and placed them in my small travel bag. The sound of each fold felt final, like closing a chapter I had read too many times. For a moment, I sat still, listening to the quiet house. Somewhere down the hall, a door creaked. His wife was probably moving about, maybe pretending not to notice that I was up. Guilt makes people move softly. I didn't blame her anymore. I had no more energy for blame. I had something stronger: intention. I walked to the window and looked outside. The morning light made the car shine faintly in the driveway, dew resting on its surface. I remembered the day he got it, how proud he was, how he hugged me, how he promised to always take care of me when I got old. I wondered if promises disappear faster than gratitude, or if both die at the same time. I could hear faint laughter from the television in the next room. He was awake now, sitting in comfort, the same man who had locked me away for asking food. My hand tightened around the documents. I wasn't going to confront him. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to beg for kindness anymore. I had begged enough. This was the hour of silence, the kind of silence that makes noise in other people's lives. I changed into clean clothes, simple, neat, the same way I had dressed for work my whole life. My movements were calm, deliberate. I wasn't escaping like a thief. I was departing like a man who had finished his work. Before leaving my room, I took one last look at the walls, once filled with laughter and pictures, now blank and hollow. I whispered a small goodbye, not to the house, but to the version of me that once lived there, the man who tolerated cruelty because he called it love. In the living room, I saw the old family portrait still hanging above the television. It showed all of us smiling, me, my wife, my son, and his little boy. I stood there, staring at that image frozen in time. My wife's eyes in the photo still had warmth, though she was long gone. I touched her face lightly through the glass and said softly in my heart, "I'm leaving, my love. I'm sorry it took me this long." The car keys jingled quietly as I picked them up from the shelf. They had always been there. He was careless that way. I slipped them into my pocket and stepped outside. The morning air was cool and crisp, smelling of rain and distant fields. I breathed it in deeply. It felt cleaner than anything I had felt inside that house in years. I opened the car door and sat inside. The seat was familiar. I had sat there many times before, teaching him to drive, telling him about patience, discipline, and humility. He had laughed back then. Those lessons had become invisible to him, but they were still alive in me. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine came to life quietly, obediently, like it remembered who its true owner was. I didn't drive far, just enough to clear my head. The city looked different that morning, as if it had been washed clean by my decision. I parked near a small cafe, walked in, and ordered a cup of black coffee. The first sip burned my tongue slightly, but the warmth settled deep inside me. I opened my phone, an old model, slow but loyal, and began making calls. The first was to my lawyer. He was surprised to hear from me, but when I told him I needed urgent paperwork handled, his tone shifted to focus. I gave him clear instructions: transfer ownership of the car for sale, prepare travel authorization papers, and initiate closure of joint accounts. He didn't ask why. Old friends don't ask, they act. The second call was to an old acquaintance who worked in vehicle trading. I gave him the car's details and told him to list it for quick sale. No haggling, no delay. The documents, I said, would reach him within hours. By noon, he had found a buyer. Cash, clean, immediate. When I hung up, I realized how easy it was to move on when you finally decide you deserve peace. The world doesn't wait for your pain. It moves the moment you take a step. I sat there for a while, looking out the window. People passed by with busy faces, some rushing to work, some laughing, some holding hands. I wondered how many of them carried hidden wounds like mine. How many smiled while breaking quietly inside. The thought made me strangely calm. Pain is universal, but survival is a choice. By afternoon, the papers were signed. The car was officially sold. The cash was in my account, safe, secure, and fully mine. I used a portion to book a one-way flight for the following night. The destination didn't matter. All I wanted was distance, from that house, from that boy, from the memory of being less than human. I spent the rest of the day tying loose ends, closed the small insurance account linked to his name, moved funds quietly, legally, left no room for confusion. Every transaction had my signature, every document stamped clean. I wasn't stealing, I was reclaiming. As evening fell, I returned home one last time. The lights were on, the smell of dinner filled the air again. I walked past them without a word. He looked at me once, but I didn't stop. I went straight to my room, packed my bag, and wrote a single letter. It said only this: "You locked me away for food. Now eat without guilt, because I'll never ask again. The car is gone. So am I. I hope one day you learn what hunger really feels like." I placed the letter on the kitchen table, right where the crumbs had been that morning. Then I turned off the light. At midnight, while the house slept, I stepped outside with my bag. The moonlight touched the edges of the road. I didn't look back. Some goodbyes deserve silence, not words. When the cab pulled away, I watched the house grow smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. I felt no sorrow, just a deep, peaceful emptiness, the kind that comes when a man has finally chosen himself. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't need to. For the first time in years, I was fully awake. Revenge, I've learned, is not about fire or shouting. It's about silence. The kind of silence that creeps into a man's bones and makes every move deliberate, every breath purposeful. When I stepped out that morning with my bag and documents, I was no longer the man who had been locked in a basement. I was the man who had survived it. And in survival, I found something sharper than rage: clarity. The air outside was cool, almost forgiving. I could still see the dew clinging to the leaves as I walked toward the street. My steps made no sound. Even the world seemed to know that what I was about to do wasn't an act of anger, but justice. The cab arrived, just as I had planned. The driver didn't ask questions. He just nodded, loaded my bag, and drove toward the city. I sat in the back seat quietly, my hand resting on the folder that carried my documents. Proof of everything I still owned. Everything he had forgotten was never his. As the city lights began to appear through the morning haze, I thought about what it took to reach this point. Years of patience, years of faith, and finally one night that stripped it all away. But even as the pain replayed in my head, the shout, the door slamming, the hunger, I felt calm. Pain, when held too long, becomes fuel, and I was ready to burn away everything that tied me to that ungrateful child. The first stop was my lawyer's office. The same man who had handled my will years ago, back when I still believed I was leaving behind blessings, not lessons. He looked older now, with gray at his temples and a face that carried stories of other broken families. But when I explained what I needed, he didn't interrupt. He just listened, his eyes heavy with the understanding that comes from witnessing too many betrayals. I handed him the documents: the car registration, the sale authorization, and the power of attorney that allowed him to finalize the transaction in my absence. He checked the signatures, the stamps, the ownership trail. Everything was in order. When he looked up, there was a small smile on his face. "You've done your homework," he said quietly. I nodded. Homework, yes, a lifetime of it. Within the next few hours, the process began. The car, that gleaming symbol of arrogance, was listed for sale under my name. It was all legal, clean, and fast. The buyer, a businessman from another part of the city, agreed to pay in full the same day. He didn't ask questions. Money rarely does. By noon, the deal was sealed. I watched from the window of a small cafe across the street as the car was driven away, the engine humming softly like it was finally free too. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't even feel relief. What I felt was balance, a scale tipping quietly back into place. That machine, once polished and shown off like a badge of success, was built from my sweat, my savings, and my trust. Now, it had been turned back into something that truly belonged to me, not in steel and leather, but in the peace it bought me. The funds were transferred directly into my account, untouched and secure. It was more than enough to start a new life. Enough to leave the country, settle quietly, and never look back. I didn't need luxury. I only needed distance. After that, I made one more stop: the bank. The staff recognized me. I had been a customer there for decades. They didn't know what had happened, and I didn't tell them. I just asked to update some information. I removed my son's joint access from every remaining account, legally, permanently, and without emotion. Each signature I wrote on those forms felt like cutting one more chain from my neck. The manager processed the changes with care, stamping each page with a firm red seal. "It's all done, sir," she said with a polite smile. I thanked her and walked out into the sunlight. The street outside was alive, people talking, buses honking, children laughing. Life was moving forward, as if to remind me that even the deepest betrayal doesn't stop the world. I spent the afternoon walking through the market, blending in with strangers. It was strange how invisible I felt. No one knew what I had endured. No one cared. But for the first time, that anonymity felt like safety. It meant I could vanish without a trace. I bought a small notebook from a corner shop and sat on a bench, writing down everything I had accomplished so far, not out of pride, but precision. I wanted no loose ends. I noted the sale confirmation, the bank closures, the final account balances, and the address of the lawyer who would handle anything left behind. My handwriting trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet intensity of finality. As the sun began to lower, painting the city gold, I returned to my small rented room near the airport. The room was plain, a bed, a table, a single window overlooking the street. I placed my bag on the bed and took out the envelope with the cash from the car sale. It was thick, crisp, and silent, like a promise kept to myself. I sat there for hours, staring at that envelope, remembering how many times I had told my son that money earned honestly never burns your hands. I wondered if he would ever understand that. Maybe not. Maybe that was his lesson to learn. That night, while the city slept, I went over my travel documents again. My passport was valid, my tickets were printed, my bank transfers were complete, everything was ready. But something inside me still ached. Not regret, but memory. It was strange how even after everything, I still felt the pull of that old house. Maybe because it wasn't just a place of pain. It was also where love had once lived, where laughter had once sounded real. I stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The world outside was calm, but my mind replayed the image of the basement, the darkness, the hunger, the loneliness. And then, the car driving away under new ownership. That image gave me peace. Justice doesn't need applause. It just needs truth. The next morning, I received a message from the buyer confirming the car's registration had officially transferred. It was done. The car was gone. The money was mine. My escape was funded. Meanwhile, back home, my son would be waking to an empty driveway. I could almost picture it, his confusion turning into disbelief, then anger, then panic. He would run outside, search the garage, maybe call the police. He would demand answers, but the paperwork would silence him. There would be nothing illegal to fight, no loopholes to exploit. The car he called his belonged to me all along. And when he checked his accounts later, he'd see my name gone from everything. He would realize, too late, that the man he had starved had left him with nothing to feed on. I didn't need to see it. I didn't need to hear his cries or his apologies. I didn't want an audience. I had lived too long to care for performances. The best revenge is the one that doesn't shout. It simply happens, quietly, completely, and beyond reach. By evening, I walked to a nearby park. The grass was soft underfoot, the trees tall and green. I sat on a bench and watched families passing by, fathers holding their children's hands, helping them cross puddles, buying them ice cream. For a moment, I felt the sting of envy, not for the joy, but for the innocence. Those fathers didn't know how fragile love could be when respect fades. Still, I smiled. I had done what I needed to do. I had answered cruelty with composure. I had reclaimed my dignity without raising my hand or my voice. When the sun set, I returned to my room and packed my final things. One small suitcase, a few clothes, the documents, the envelope of cash, nothing more. Before I lay down, I opened my notebook again and wrote a single line under everything else. He took my food. I took his comfort. The scales are even now. I closed the book, placed it in my bag, and turned off the light. Sleep came easily that night, deep, dreamless, clean. The next day, I would leave the country. But that night, for the first time in years, I rested like a man who owed nothing to anyone. And as I drifted off, I whispered a truth I had learned too late, but lived just in time. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it signs a paper and walks away. The morning of my departure began like any other, quiet, still, and painted with the soft gray of dawn. But this time, the silence was mine. It didn't suffocate me, it freed me. I stood by the window of that small room near the airport and watched the sky shift from pale blue to gold. For years, I had woken up for someone else's needs. That morning, I woke up for myself. I had packed the night before. One suitcase, one passport, one notebook, and a few pieces of clothing. Nothing more. The less I carried, the lighter I felt. I folded each shirt slowly, not with care, but with finality. Each fold was a closing door, a chapter shut without tears. The bag looked small, but it carried my whole life, not the material one, but the one that still had dignity left in it. I sat on the edge of the bed and took out the letter I had written for him. It wasn't long. I had no need for long words anymore. It simply said, "You locked me away for food. Now you'll eat in a house where your father's shadow no longer lives. I wish you learn hunger, not the hunger of stomach, but of heart." I sealed it quietly in an envelope and placed it on top of the table near the door. He would find it later, perhaps after realizing the car was gone, the accounts were empty, and his arrogance had finally met silence. The street outside was empty when I stepped out. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the smell of wet earth. A bird sang from a nearby wire, and for the first time in many years, that sound didn't feel far away. I hailed a cab. The driver looked tired, uninterested, but polite. "Airport?" he asked. I nodded. That was the only word I spoke for the next 30 minutes. The city passed by in flashes. Markets opening, vendors setting up stalls, children in school uniforms laughing, buses roaring down the main road. Life moved without pause, as if unaware that one man inside a cab was leaving behind everything he had known. I looked out at it all, and for a moment, my eyes filled. Not with sadness, with gratitude. Gratitude that I had lived long enough to learn the truth about people, even if it broke me. Gratitude that I still had time to rebuild something pure. When we reached the airport, I paid the fare in cash and thanked the driver softly. He nodded, wished me a safe journey, and drove off. The sound of the cab fading into the distance felt like the last tie snapping from my old life. I stood there for a while, staring at the large glass doors of the terminal. Inside, people hurried with luggage, announcements echoed, and screens flickered with flight numbers. I took a deep breath and walked in. The line at check-in was long, but I didn't mind. I had waited longer for respect in my own house than I ever would for a flight. When my turn came, I handed over my passport and ticket. The woman at the counter smiled mechanically and asked where I was headed. I said the name of a country far away, a place I had once dreamed of visiting but never had time for. She typed for a while, then handed back my documents. "Have a safe trip," she said. Her voice was kind, but distant, like a stranger's blessing. I passed through security without trouble. My bag was small enough to carry. My heart was light enough to let go. I found my gate and sat near the window, watching the runway where planes taxied and took off. Each one rose slowly, then disappeared into the clouds, just like I would in a few hours. As I waited, memories came in waves. Not sharp ones anymore, but soft, faded ones. My son as a boy, chasing after me in the fields, his laughter echoing in the wind. The way he once held my hand, afraid of thunder. Somewhere along the years, that child had vanished. In his place stood a man who saw kindness as weakness and care as burden. I had spent years blaming myself for raising him wrong. But now I understood. Love doesn't fail when it gives. It fails when it expects return. The announcement for boarding came. I stood, adjusted my coat, and joined the line. The people around me talked about vacations, work, family. I stayed silent, but inside me, A storm of feelings settled into calm waves. The line moved slowly, but I didn't mind. I wasn't running away. I was walking toward something better: peace, freedom, silence. Once on board, I found my seat by the window. The hum of the engines was soothing. The flight attendant offered me water. I thanked her. When the plane began to move, I closed my eyes. The runway blurred beneath us, and then, slowly, the ground began to fall away. The city shrank. The streets turned to lines, the houses to dots. My old life disappeared beneath the clouds. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Some goodbyes don't deserve the dignity of a glance. Hours passed. The sky outside turned a deep blue. I thought about what I would do when I landed. I had enough money to live simply, quietly, for the rest of my life. I would find a small place near the sea where mornings were filled with birds and evenings with the sound of waves. I would eat when I wanted, sleep when I wished, and speak only to those who treated me as human. That was my new dream. Not wealth, not revenge, just peace. I thought of my wife then, her laughter, her soft voice, the way she used to bring me food after long days in the field. I imagined her sitting beside me, smiling. I hoped, wherever she was, she knew I was finally free. When the plane landed, the air was different, warmer, lighter, unfamiliar but kind. I walked through immigration without trouble. No one here knew my name, my story, or my pain. It felt like stepping into a clean page. Outside the airport, I took a taxi to a small inn near the coast. The room was modest, but had a window overlooking the ocean. The first thing I did was open that window. The wind rushed in, carrying the smell of salt and freedom. I stood there for a long time, breathing deeply, letting the sea wash away the last traces of anger. That night, I had my first full meal in weeks: warm soup, bread, and tea. It wasn't fancy, but it felt sacred. Every bite tasted like dignity. I didn't rush. I didn't think of who wasn't there. I only thought of how good it felt to be alive, to feed myself with no fear of cruelty. Later, as I lay in bed, I thought of the house I left behind. I imagined him finding my letter. I pictured the confusion, the guilt, the panic. But more than that, I pictured silence, the kind of silence that follows realization. Maybe one day he would understand what he had done. Maybe he wouldn't. Either way, I had no interest in watching. The next morning, I woke early and walked to the beach. The sand was cool beneath my feet, the waves gentle. The sunrise painted the water gold, and for the first time in years, I smiled without forcing it. I wasn't rich, I wasn't powerful, but I was free. And that felt like everything. I bought a small notebook from a local shop and wrote on the first page, "Freedom tastes like the first meal after hunger, the first breath after fear." Days turned into weeks. I built a quiet routine: morning walks, small meals, evenings by the shore. I kept to myself, spoke little, and lived simply. No locks, no shouting, no begging for respect. Just life, honest and peaceful. Sometimes I'd see fathers and sons walking together along the beach, laughing, arguing, living. I'd watch them for a moment, then turn away. I had no bitterness left. Only understanding. Some people love until they break. Others learn to leave before breaking again. I began sending small donations anonymously to an old-age home back in my country. I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. I just wanted to make sure others like me, forgotten, humiliated, but still breathing, found warmth where I once found pain. Every night, before sleeping, I looked out at the sea and whispered the same thing. You can't lock freedom, not forever. And as the waves answered back, crashing gently against the shore, I realized something. Revenge hadn't saved me. Leaving had. The moment I walked out of that house, I didn't just escape him. I escaped the version of myself that had been waiting for kindness that would never come. I didn't vanish to hide. I vanished to live. Morning light has a strange way of exposing truth. It shines without mercy, crawling through curtains and reminding people of what they've done. That morning, the same light that once woke my son gently now fell on an empty driveway. He didn't notice it at first. He woke up yawning, stretching like a man with no worries, still heavy from the sleep of arrogance. But when he stepped out to start his car, the car he called his pride, his hard-earned trophy, the spot was bare. The driveway was just concrete, blank and echoing with absence. At first, he thought it had been towed, then maybe stolen. He ran to the street, looked left and right, called out for help that never came. He ran his fingers through his hair, confusion turning to panic. The sun glared down on his face as sweat broke across his forehead. He paced in circles, muttering to himself, replaying the night before, trying to find logic in what had just happened. But logic doesn't live in guilt. It hides from men who have forgotten kindness. He stormed back into the house, shouting for his wife, slamming drawers, searching for keys, calling the police. His voice carried through the quiet neighborhood. People peeked out from their windows. Some whispered, others shook their heads. They had heard stories about how he treated his old father, how the shouting sometimes echoed through the nights. They had seen me disappear days earlier, suitcase in hand, quiet as a shadow. They didn't need to guess what had happened. They already knew. When the police arrived, he spun a story, frantic, loud, full of blame. He said his father must have done something crazy, that the old man had been unstable lately. The officers listened patiently, took notes, and then one of them asked for proof of ownership. He handed over the car's registration papers confidently, expecting validation. But when the officer pointed to the name printed neatly under owner, his face drained of color. The name wasn't his. It was mine. Silence filled the air like thick smoke. The officer looked up from the papers and said, "Sir, this vehicle was legally registered to your father. There's no theft here. It's a lawful sale." The words hit him harder than any slap ever could. He stumbled, searching for a comeback, but his voice cracked. "That's impossible," he muttered, but the officer had already closed his notebook. The realization spread across his face, slow, suffocating, undeniable. He had built his pride on something that was never his. The car, the comfort, even the house, all tied by the threads of a man he had betrayed, and now those threads had been cut. He went inside and grabbed his phone, calling the bank in desperation. His hand shook as he punched the numbers. The automated voice spoke first, then a representative came on the line. They verified his details, asked security questions, then paused. The tone changed. "Sir, this account has been recently updated. Joint access has been removed as per authorization from the primary holder." The silence that followed was long and bitter. I can imagine his face, blank, hollow, the first true expression of loss. He tried another account. Same result. Another. Same message. His name, once sitting comfortably beside mine, was now gone from every page, every login, every card. The empire of entitlement he had built was dissolving in real time. His wife came into the room, asking what happened. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The only thing left in his hands was a phone filled with disconnected numbers and a life built on borrowed kindness. As hours passed, the panic spread. He called my lawyer, the same man I had spoken to just days before. The lawyer refused to discuss details, bound by confidentiality. "All transactions were lawful," he said. "Your father acted within his rights." That line echoed in his mind like a verdict. Lawful. Within his rights. Words he had never thought would stand against him. By afternoon, the house that once felt like a kingdom became a tomb. He sat on the couch, head in his hands, surrounded by silence that no apology could break. Every ticking second from the wall clock was a reminder of how fast love can turn into consequence. He tried to reach relatives, hoping someone would intervene, but they had already heard the story. Word spreads fast in small towns, especially stories of betrayal. The whispers that once pitied me now pitied him. "He locked his father in the basement," they said. The old man left and took his peace with him. Neighbors avoided his eyes. Old friends didn't return his calls. Even his business contacts grew cold. No one wanted to be tied to a man exposed for cruelty. That night, he sat alone in the kitchen. The same table where he once mocked me for asking food now sat empty. The smell of cooked rice filled the air, but he couldn't eat. Every bite reminded him of that night, the plate thrown, the cruel words, the basement door closing. Hunger was no longer physical, it was emotional. He was starving for forgiveness, but there was no one left to feed it to him. He found the letter later that evening. It was sitting exactly where I had left it, on the table, beside the crumbs of his arrogance. His hands trembled as he opened it. My handwriting, steady and clean, stared back at him. The words were simple, sharp, final. As he read, his breath caught halfway through. There were no curses, no hatred, no threats, just truth. Truth, written in the quiet tone of a man who had suffered and risen above it. He read the letter again and again until the paper crumpled in his hands. Then he cried, not the loud, angry cries of pride, but the broken sobs of realization. He called out my name once, twice, but the walls didn't answer. For the first time in his life, he understood what silence could mean. Days turned into weeks, and his desperation grew heavier. He tried to undo what I had done, but paperwork, once sealed and stamped, doesn't feel pity. The house was still legally half mine. The accounts were out of his reach. The car was long gone. Every legal door he knocked on closed gently in his face, not with anger, but with indifference. The law doesn't care about regret. He went back to work eventually, pretending nothing had happened. But the whispers followed him there too. Colleagues who once admired him now spoke softly when he entered the room. Some had seen the police at his house that morning. Others had heard about the investigation into the car. Reputation dies faster than love, and his had been buried overnight. Each day, the mirror showed him a little more of the truth, the hollow cheeks, the sleepless eyes, the tired posture of a man carrying his own guilt. His wife, too, grew distant. She couldn't bear the shame of being tied to a man the town now called ungrateful. She spent more time at her mother's house, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He stopped answering calls, he stopped smiling, he started drinking. The nights became long, the mornings empty, and somewhere between one glass and the next, he realized something I had known all along. Regret doesn't fix what cruelty breaks. I wasn't there to see any of this, but I didn't need to. People told me, in whispers and letters, about what became of him. They said he changed. They said he became quieter, almost humble. But I didn't rejoice. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I simply nodded, because life has a way of teaching lessons even when the teacher is gone. Sometimes I'd sit by my window in the new country, reading those updates, sipping my tea, and thinking of him. The boy I raised, the man he became, the stranger who broke my trust. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate ties you back to the very thing you escaped. I had let go. Some nights, I imagined him standing in that kitchen again, staring at the letter, whispering apologies to an empty chair. I imagined the sound of the clock ticking behind him, marking each second of silence that now belonged to him, the same silence he once gave me. Karma doesn't arrive like thunder. It walks quietly, step by step, until it stands beside the one who earned it. And when it doesn't shout. It simply reminds. The son who once locked me in a basement now lived in one of his own making, not of bricks and locks, but of guilt and memory. A prison built not by walls, but by conscience. And somewhere, far away, I was free. The hardest part of starting over isn't the distance, it's the quiet. The kind that sits beside you in the mornings when you wake and asks, "What now?" For years, my life had been defined by noise, shouting, footsteps, slammed doors, the constant hum of trying to prove my worth in a house that refused to see it. But in this new land, far from that cruelty, I woke to something else entirely. Silence that didn't hurt. Silence that healed. The first few mornings felt strange. I would wake up before dawn, out of old habit, expecting to hear familiar sounds. The creak of the old wooden stairs, the sound of someone moving in the kitchen. But all I heard was the soft whisper of the sea beyond my window. The rhythm of the waves became my clock. Each crash against the shore felt like a heartbeat reminding me, "You're still here." You made it out. I rented a small house by the coast, nothing fancy, but filled with peace. The walls were white and clean, the windows open to sunlight and salt air. The landlord was a kind woman with a gentle smile and no questions. She handed me the keys, wished me luck, and that was it. No curiosity, no gossip. I liked that. Here, I wasn't the father who was betrayed. I was just an old man starting over. Each morning I brewed a cup of tea and sat by the open window. I watched fishermen prepare their boats, children run down to the shore, and old women hang laundry in the wind. Life here was simple, honest. People didn't rush, didn't compete. They greeted each other with small smiles and kept moving. No one demanded explanations. That simplicity became my medicine. I began to rediscover small joys I had forgotten. The warmth of sunlight on my hands, the smell of fresh bread from the market, the sound of rain on the roof. I started keeping a small notebook, not to record revenge or regret, but gratitude. Every night, I wrote one line, something I was thankful for. The first entry said, "I ate in peace today." It seemed small, but after everything I'd been through, it felt like victory. The days flowed slowly. I explored the town, walked along the beach, and bought groceries from the same friendly vendor each week. He didn't know my story, and I didn't offer it. Sometimes he gave me an extra fruit or loaf of bread for free, with a wink. I always paid anyway. Kindness doesn't need to be taken. It needs to be honored. I began volunteering at a small local shelter for elderly people who had nowhere to go. I didn't tell them I had once been one of them. Trapped, humiliated, unwanted. I just listened. Their stories were pieces of my own pain, told in different voices. Some had been abandoned by children, others forgotten by time. We didn't need to say much. We understood each other through silence. Every time I helped serve food or fix a broken chair, I felt something return, not power, but purpose. Money was no longer my goal. I lived simply and spent carefully. The funds from the car and my savings were enough. I donated small portions each month, to the shelter, to the local orphanage, to places where pain had no voice. It wasn't charity. It was cleansing. I didn't want wealth. I wanted balance. I wanted to leave a mark that didn't rot like greed. Sometimes I'd walk to the top of a small hill that overlooked the sea. I'd sit there for hours, feeling the wind push against my face. That wind reminded me that freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums softly through your hair. I thought of my son often, but not with anger. Anger is a chain that ties you to the very person you escaped. Instead, I thought of him with distance, like a story that belonged to another man's life. I never reached out, never called, never checked. Some part of me wanted to know if he was okay, if guilt had changed him. But another part of me knew that forgiveness doesn't require return. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, is when you stop needing the other person to understand. I had reached that point. I didn't forgive him for his sake. I forgave him for mine. The world I built for myself here was small, but whole. I grew a few plants by the window, mint, basil, and a small lemon tree that I tended like a child. Watching them grow reminded me that patience and care still create beauty. The land may change, but nurture remains the same. I had once grown crops for others to eat. Now I grew peace for myself. In the evenings, I'd walk to the pier where the fishermen gathered after sunset. They'd talk and laugh, their faces tanned from years of work. Sometimes one of them would offer me a seat and a piece of bread or fish. I'd share my tea. We didn't need to speak the same language perfectly. Kindness has its own. One night, an old fisherman told me something in broken English that stayed with me. Sea always take, but sea also give back. I smiled. He didn't know it, but he'd just described my whole life. Months passed, and I built a routine that healed me more than I expected. I ate well, slept deeply, worked quietly. The nightmares of that basement began to fade. The sound of my son's voice yelling, that hateful moment, turned from thunder to a faint whisper. My body grew stronger, my steps steadier. Sometimes, when I looked at my reflection, I almost didn't recognize myself. The tired, hollow man who once sat on a basement floor had been replaced by someone lighter. Older, yes, but free. The small town slowly accepted me as one of their own. Children called me Grandpa. Neighbors brought me fruit during festivals, and I returned the favor with handmade gifts, small carvings I made from driftwood. It became my quiet hobby. Each carving carried meaning: a bird for freedom, a wave for resilience, a tree for roots that survive any storm. Once, I carved a pair of hands, rough, wrinkled, open, and placed them on a stone near the beach. I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. Some things are meant to be left anonymous, like redemption. Seasons changed. I watched the town transform with time, from sunny days to soft rains, from festivals to quiet winters. Each season felt like a page turned in a book I thought had ended. Life, it seems, doesn't close when people betray you. It simply shifts to a new chapter where their names don't matter anymore. In that peace, I found laughter again. Small, quiet laughter, the kind that escapes when you realize the world is bigger than your pain. I learned to enjoy solitude not as punishment, but as privilege. Loneliness hurts when you're surrounded by cruelty, but when you're surrounded by peace, it becomes comfort. Years passed this way. I grew older, slower, but not weaker. People often asked if I missed my family. I always answered honestly, I miss what family used to mean. That usually ended the conversation. Some nights, I'd light a small candle by the window and think of my wife, of the early years when love was simple and sincere. I'd imagine her smiling, proud that I found my way out of darkness. I'd imagine her voice saying, "You did what you had to do." And in that moment, I'd feel complete. Because I hadn't just escaped my son. I had escaped becoming like him. I didn't let his cruelty poison me. I didn't seek revenge through ruin. I sought it through peace, through the act of living well after being broken. Every day that I woke up without fear was victory. Every meal I ate in peace was justice. Every quiet sunset I watched was forgiveness. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, I wrote one final line in my notebook. The same one that started with, "I ate in peace today." It said, "I was locked in a basement, but I built a world without walls." And as I closed the notebook, I realized that my story, all of it, the pain, the betrayal, the leaving, had led to this one truth. Freedom isn't running away. It's staying gone long enough for peace to find you. Now, as an old man, I sit by the sea every morning with a cup of warm tea and the sound of waves as my only company. The wind carries no voices here, no shouts, no arguments, no echoes of a son's cruelty, just calm. Sometimes I watch the sun rise and think about how far I've come, not in miles, but in spirit. From the basement where I sat hungry and forgotten, to this quiet corner of the world where peace finally feels like mine. It has been a long journey, one that started with heartbreak but ended with freedom. People often say old age makes you forgetful, but I remember everything. Every insult, every silence, every time my kindness was mistaken for weakness. The difference now is that memory no longer hurts. It just exists. Like old scars, reminders, not wounds. Time doesn't erase pain. It just teaches you how to live beside it without letting it own you. When I think of my son, I don't see the boy I raised anymore. I see a man who was swallowed by greed, who lost his humanity one cruel word at a time. For years, I wondered what went wrong. Was it my fault for giving too much? Was it his for never learning gratitude? Maybe it was both. Maybe love, when unconditional, teaches people to stop earning it. I realize now, love without boundaries isn't kindness. It's surrender. I spent my youth building something lasting, a home, a name, a family. But the truth is, nothing built on selfishness can stand forever. The son who once promised to take care of me turned my trust into a cage. And yet, in that darkness, I discovered something stronger than revenge. Clarity. The kind that comes when you stop expecting others to see your worth and start living by it yourself. There were days I used to imagine confronting him, standing face to face and asking why. Why the cruelty? Why the shame? Why treat the hands that raised him like a burden? But I never did, because some answers don't bring peace. They only dig deeper holes in your heart. The best closure, I learned, isn't hearing why they hurt you. It's understanding you survived anyway. When I first left, I thought I was escaping. But I wasn't running away. I was walking toward something better. Peace doesn't come from revenge or justice. It comes from detachment, from realizing that you don't owe anyone the right to break you twice. Leaving wasn't weakness. It was the only way to protect what little of myself I had left. Here, in this small coastal town, I've built a quiet kind of happiness. I have no riches, no grand house, no audience to applaud my survival. But I have what I was denied for years: dignity. Every simple meal I eat, every night I sleep without fear, every morning I wake to the sound of the sea. It all feels sacred. I watch young fathers with their sons sometimes, walking along the shore, their laughter carried by the wind. It makes me smile and ache all at once, not from jealousy, but from memory. I hope they never forget the weight of love, never let arrogance steal what is precious. I hope they learn early what my son never did, that respect is worth more than inheritance. Sometimes the locals here ask about my past. I tell them only pieces, that I worked hard once, that I had a family, that life taught me lessons the hard way. They don't need to know the rest. Pain doesn't have to be repeated to stay true. It lives quietly in the space between words. There are nights when I dream of the house I left behind, the basement, the locked door, the sound of footsteps fading away. But the dream always changes. Now, when I wake, I'm not gasping or angry. I simply breathe and look at the ceiling of my new home and whisper to myself, "You made it out." That's enough. I don't believe in revenge anymore. I believe in balance. I believe that cruelty finds its way back to the people who practice it, not because someone punishes them, but because they eventually meet themselves. My son, wherever he is, must live with the echo of his own choices. That's not my burden anymore. It's his mirror. What I've learned through all this is simple. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing peace over poison. I forgave him the day I stopped hoping he'd change, because hope, when misplaced, becomes its own prison. Now, I give my time to people who understand the language of kindness. I sit with the old, the lonely, the ones discarded by their families. We share tea, stories, laughter, sometimes silence. In their eyes, I see the same story, different details, same ache. But I also see resilience. People can break your trust, but they can't steal your ability to rebuild. Every now and then, I receive a letter from back home, old neighbors writing about how things changed after I left. They say my son rarely smiles now. They say he avoids speaking of me. Some claim he regrets everything. I don't know if it's true. I don't need it to be. Regret doesn't fix the past. It only acknowledges it came with a price. If I could speak to him one last time, I wouldn't ask for apologies. I'd tell him what life taught me, that love without respect dies young, and greed leaves you starving in ways food can't cure. I'd tell him I don't hate him, but I pity him. Because while I lost a son, he lost his soul. And yet, I wish him peace. Not comfort, peace. The kind that comes when you finally see the weight of your own actions and decide to be better. Because even though he hurt me, he's still a part of the story that made me who I am. Without him, I wouldn't have found the strength to walk away, to live again, to become my own man one last time. As I write this, the sun begins to sink into the ocean, turning everything gold. I watch the horizon blur, and I think of all the endings I once feared. But endings, I've learned, are not failures. They're transitions. Every goodbye carries a quiet gift. Mine gave me back my freedom. This peace I have now, it didn't come easy. It cost me a family, a home, a lifetime of trust. But it gave me something priceless in return. Myself. The version of me that no cruelty could break. So when people ask how I survived, I tell them the truth. By choosing silence over shouting, distance over despair, and peace over pity. You can rebuild from nothing, as long as you don't let bitterness take root. Before I close my notebook each night, I write one last thought to remind myself that even pain can bloom into wisdom. Last night's line read, "He locked me away, but he couldn't keep me from walking out when the door finally opened." And tomorrow night, I know what I'll write. He took everything, except my will to live with grace. I am old now. My hair is white, my hands tremble, but my heart is steady. Life didn't end the night he locked me away. It began the morning I left. I have no hate left in me, only lessons. Final thought, he thought hunger would humble me. But in starving me, he taught me how to feed my own peace. He locked me in the dark, and I found light in silence. I didn't escape to punish him. I escaped to protect what was left of me, and that perhaps is the truest revenge of all. To live well, to live free, and to never look back.